The best part about executive orders in my research, I found out that after the Youngstown case came, and Truman was a little sore about the whole thing, Justice Hugo Black, who issued the opinion, who authored the opinion for the majority of the court, hosted a barbecue at his house in Alexandria, Virginia, or it was Arlington, wherever. And he invited everyone on the Supreme Court and the president to show up. Now think about it. You think that's going to happen now?
Welcome to the Republic Podcast, where history meets scrutiny and facts matter. Join Rob and Lou as they dive deep into the foundations of American democracy, dissect the laws that shape our lives, and challenge the narratives behind today's headlines. From forgotten chapters in the U.S. history to the legal truths they didn't teach you in school. This is your front row seat to get informed, unapologetic conversation. We have an American republic, if we can keep it. Now, let's get started. And we're back.
Damn. Welcome back.
Welcome back to the Republic, If You Can Keep It podcast.
If you can keep it. And you can, and spread the word, by the way.
Right. Like, share, subscribe, hitting it up already. Got to get that algorithm in.
Beat that algorithm to our own drum, baby. Make it useful for us. So, as you all know, I'm Rob.
I'm Lou.
There you go.
Cheers to you all. Cheers, brother.
Cheers.
And here's to another riveting rant session that we're going to have on the Article 2 powers of the president.
Bet you never heard that sentence put together before.
So, what are we covering today? Again, you heard on our last session that we talked about the Article 2 powers of the president and enumerated them. And that what we're looking at doing is sort of going into more in depth as far as some of the actual issues. What does the commander-in-chief, what do those powers actually entail? The vesting of the executive powers, what does that actually mean? The whole thing of the ability for the president to faithfully execute the powers that he has and the laws of the United States under his own authority.
And we try to go at this, as we talked about from the beginning. We want to go through, ultimately we're going to go through history and events and individual people, but we wanted to start with the foundational documents, the Declaration of Independence. We want to talk about the Constitution. Those are the foundational pieces of the country, and you need to know that. We're here not as a law school seminar that would keep you potentially in a position like this in the back of a class somewhere. If someone was just doing a road, then this is what Article 1 says.
Wait, did you see me in law school?
I'll tell you about my law school professor at another time. That's a ixnay on the professor say.
So anyway,
at the end of the day, though, again, bring it back to the whole genesis of all this. We want people to be engaged. We want you to know the foundations of the country because we want you to be proud of this country. We want you to, if you're an American, we want you to be proud to be American. If you're not American and you're interested in the country, we want you to be interested and curious about where did this come from? What's going on with this? So be proud to be American. And we're going to go through, as we've done, we do the Declaration of Independence. We call it a rant session. It's like the follow-up. It kind of ties different things in, tells you how the structure and what the formula of it was. How was it drafted? Why was it drafted? And how does it apply today? And here we are doing it with Article 2, executive power as drawn out in the Constitution from 1787.
Right. And exactly that. The more and more lately, especially over the past few presidencies, I think going back even to Reagan and forward, that you've had executive authority and executive powers really tested, more so than I think that than anyone ever knew. Although looking at the history of it, that you had substantial challenges to presidential authority since the founding of our country. And I think that the main thing that we have to start off with is the discussions regarding what Article 2 and how it actually really came about. Because
right.
As everything within this Constitution, everything was a compromise. You had the Federalists, you had the Anti-Federalists, you had the Loyalists, you had so many different factions where it makes our Congress look like kumbaya side by side people because it was just such a discussion. And it's one of those things where nobody that the document came to a compromise on a lot of different things. And the Article 2 is really one where there was a discussion as far as having a panel of people being in charge of the country. Then you had one where how do you get elected and how long would the terms be and what are the actual powers where we didn't want to go and fall into essentially an elected monarchy all over again.
Right. So let's go back to the Article 2. It gives the executive authority. And the executive authority is that the president is the commander in chief. You can appoint judges and members of the executive branch, officers, ambassadors, make treaties, grant reprieves and pardons, and the big one, in my view, make sure and to take care that the laws are faithfully executed. And people always say,
Huge.
well, Supreme Court justice nominations and this and that, all important, don't get me wrong. But at the end of the day, the executive was put in place to make sure that the laws of this country are faithfully executed. Right?
And that's huge. I mean, that's a huge thing where, as we'll discuss, it's a matter of where does that authority end? Where does it begin? Where does it end? And also that has a whole thing playing into executive orders, which we'll discuss. And it's just the president has such substantial authority that it's really it's great because it's something where we needed somebody that was when Congress was bogged down in discussions
They never
and
get
delivering
bogged
anything,
down.
that when they were discussing the issues and really going through how to figure out what to codify and how to pass a law, if the president sees that there's an immediate need and it's an urgent need, they have the authority to go in and do something through either their own inherent powers or executive order.
So let's go back to the Constitutional Convention and the
Back
biggest,
in the beginning.
I know. So we're talking about some of the biggest debates of the convention were about Article 2. And first, and we talked about this a little bit in the last episode, how much power do you give the executive? Remember, this is fresh on the heels of our country winning a war of independence against the King of England. Did not want another sovereign. We did not want another king. We did not want to have, and we were frankly scared, the collective we, of having such a thing happen here in the United States. So the anti-federalists certainly had a huge toehold on which to stand and say, we don't want to do this. So there was a huge display of debate back and forth, such that some people wanted, the Federalists, like Alexander Hamilton, wanted a strong executive. You've got the anti-federalists who were like, no, maybe we should have a committee to be the executive branch with us, 3, 5, whatever. There were a whole bunch of things bandied about. It was actually James Wilson, the Constitutional Convention attendee from Pennsylvania, who really settled the score here. And he affixed it and got everyone to compromise on one person as the president of the United States. They didn't want him to be a sovereign, but they talked about him. I think the words in the convention and the debates were such that they wanted him to be an energetic leader. Describe that as you may, whatever.
What the hell is that?
I know. And then, of course, they get to things like, how do you elect the president? Again, wide array of debate. People wanted just a strict popular vote. Some people said, no, we don't trust the people. We want Congress to do a vote. And ultimately it became down to the Electoral College, which is a whole thing we'll get to at some other time about how that is. But all of these things are being debated back and forth, and it's all about the executive, and they wanted to make sure they didn't have another King George III.
Right. And so they struck this compromise where it came down where the president would be elected to a 4-year term, and that he would have these powers where, as we've discussed before, that the Constitution was actually supposed to be a limit on governmental authority.
Right.
That the original framers were believing that if it's not specifically enumerated inside there, then the president, the Congress, the courts don't have that authority.
We're going to get to that.
really, when you have certain things, when you leave, as as lawyers, both Rob and I could discuss that when you leave something open to interpretation, what you have to do is you have to take that interpretation to the most extreme one end and the other, because that's really what what happens, and that's, as we'll discuss, that's really what has happened.
Right. Because when we talk about executive authority, what's the one thing that people really, for the past, certainly the past 30, 40 years or more, have really started talking about, saying if there's anyone who's concerned about an overreach by the executive branch, it's with the use of executive orders. And when we were talking about this last time, we were talking about an act from 1976 and other things, and we started doing more digging. Executive orders have been in play since the very beginning. George Washington actually did 8. He did 8 executive orders. His vice president, and then the second president of the United States, John Adams, did 1. And there was very limited use through the early 1800s into the mid 1800s until Abe Lincoln came along. And with the Civil War, he wasn't afraid to say, we need to do things. And he did 48, which was unheard of. And one of those executive orders that people might not have glossed over as an executive order, the Emancipation Proclamation. He saw, here's the Congress who have been debating, and this country's been debating, how do you deal with slavery? That issue, which kept getting bounced back and forth, and there was this and there was that, and then we kicked the can down the road. Then there was the Missouri Compromise, and da-da-da-da-da. In the middle of the war, 1863, he said, I've had enough. I'm going to do an executive order. And he signed the Emancipation Proclamation, an executive order.
Right. And the one thing about that is that's really where, if you wanted to take it to a legal argument, what greater, you are basically affecting so many people. That is huge as an executive order.
Right.
And it still has, until, other acts of Congress came up in the 1900s, like the 1960s, with certain acts, really had never been codified either.
Right.
And so you have an executive order that's still in effect from the 1860s, which has property rights, has freedom rights, has all these different rights. And so if people are going to argue that the president doesn't have the authority to do something, the ultimate look back is, well, what about this? And that's something where people still don't understand, where that's an incredible authority that the president has. And there's, really, if you take a look at it, there's no real basis for it in actually any of the Article 2 powers.
Right. It's an implied power.
Right. It's an implied power where, as a leader of the country, he has that authority to do that. But if you're a strict constitutional constructionist, as we'll talk about, the argument is there's no authority for these executive orders, that they are essentially something that was created by the president and sort of accepted by the courts and by the legislature, but really have no foundation in the Constitution.
Right.
You could make an argument that it's in the, faithful execution orders, powers that he has, as far as the, faith, that they take care of faithfully laws faithfully executed, but they have to rely upon a legislatively passed law in order to have that effect.
So after Abe, the presidents in the later 1800s into the first part of the 20th century, maybe 100, 200 executive orders we found in some of our research. And then Teddy Roosevelt comes on the stage, bully, with his speak softly and carry a big stick. Well, he had a big stick.
Well, he carried a big stick on this one.
And Teddy Roosevelt executed 1,081 executive orders, when before it was like maybe 100, something like that. And President Wilson, after that, 1,803. And wedged in there is Howard Taft. President Taft, who later turned out to be our Chief Justice on the Supreme Court, was a constitutionalist. And Taft only did a handful, if hardly any, executive orders because he believed, as Lou was saying, I'm a constitutionalist. If it doesn't specifically say it, if I don't have the authority, I'm not given the explicit authority to do it, I can't do it. Whereas Teddy Roosevelt and President Woodrow Wilson were like, you know what? We have an expansive view. If the president can do anything, unless the Constitution doesn't say we can. So if it doesn't say we can, we're going to fill in the void.
Rather beg forgiveness and ask permission.
Bingo. So all of this stuff came to a head in 1952 with President Truman, the seminal case of Youngstown Steel and Tube Company versus Sawyer. We're in the middle of the Korean War. Steel workers go on strike. President Truman's like, whoa. We need steel for the war effort. And Congress wasn't acting. And he said, I'm going to step in the breach. Go screw yourselves. And he issued an executive order to seize the steel plants to make sure that they kept in full operation. Well, this was called an overreach. It went up to the Supreme Court. Truman thought, everyone on the bench is either someone that I appointed or my predecessor, who I used to be vice president with, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, put on the bench. So this should be in the bag. Well, guess what? Independent judiciary comes in and says 6-3 vote. Not so fast, my friend.
Not so fast.
And they struck down the executive order. There are rules that were put into place by the Supreme Court about when and how and all this other stuff, which are still kind of vague and are kind of vague guidelines. But everyone looks back to the Youngstown case for guidance if there is a court case about an executive order now. I will say, I told this to Lou before we started recording, the best part about executive orders in my research, I found out that after the Youngstown case came, and Truman was a little sore about the whole thing, Justice Hugo Black, who was issued the opinion, who authored the opinion for the majority of the court, hosted a barbecue at his house in Alexandria, Virginia, or no, it was Arlington, wherever. And he invited everyone on the Supreme Court and the president to show up. Now think about it. You think that's going to happen now? Oh my God. Anyway, but it happened. And President Truman evidently, and I quote, is on record as saying, and Justice Black's first name was Hugo. Hugo, I don't much care for your law, but by golly, this bourbon is good.
You got to love a good bourbon. I can't go wrong with that.
So I love President Truman, but we'll get to him at some other late when we start talking about the presidents, but that's a whole other thing. But anyway, the courts are there to put checks and balances, just like there are checks and balances with the executive on the legislative, with the veto power, et cetera, et cetera. But executive orders still kind of go out of control. And not every executive order is sued. And I'm not suggesting that there should be a suit about every one of them, but it's still an open question to a large degree.
I mean, and it's really, it comes down to a philosophical debate where, again, I think personally, while I understand the need for executive orders and to go into that breach, as Rob said, to sort of fill in the gaps when you need to, that I don't think that it's right for executive orders to be issued and ongoing.
Right.
That the executive order was meant to go to fill that gap, to go into that breach while something was being debated. And then once Congress debates it, to pass a law one way or the other. We're not doing that. And to have some of these things where no matter what your philosophy is, no matter what your, again, no matter what your political belief is, one way or the other, these executive orders like DACA, like other orders that have come into play, it's something where they weren't meant to be lasting, and that executive orders by design were only meant to last. My belief on it is to last during that presidency. And if it was something that's serious and that needy, Congress should act upon it. And if Congress doesn't take that up to act upon it, again, this is just my Lou's rant on it, Lou's belief on it, is that by nature, it should come to end at the end of that president's term. You should not be able to affect an executive order that then burdens presidents going forward forever. And I don't mean I'm not hitting on the Emancipation Proclamation. That was something that I think all of us can say was outstanding and needed to be done. But this is something that Congress should have codified then later on.
That's why we always talk about things, you know, things in the law, and people always yell at lawyers and, oh, you lawyers make, make everything murky and this and that and blah, 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 blah. You make everything overly complicated. And sometimes we do, and there's no doubt about it. But we are particularly trained to look at all things from all facets. And executive orders, I'm much in line with what Lou says, but I suppose I come from it from a different angle. I suppose I am more of a constitutionalist where I think about the laws were supposed to be drafted by Congress. The executive isn't supposed to enact laws. But then, I have it shoved in my face by myself saying, what about the Emancipation Proclamation?
I said,
Myself, what about the Emancipation Proclamation? And you're like, good point. Good point. But then you get things that are such overreach, and you get things that are so beyond the scope of the executive branch, which is what Article 2 is about. If there's going to be an interpretation of this implied power, it should be implied as to the executive branch itself, not that it can write its own laws about anything and everything. There's no way that there should be an executive order that says, there was some talk some time ago that there should be some limitation on Article 3 powers. There should be some limitation on certain things with Congress. There have been different administrations talking about doing executive orders about term limits, which I don't think never gets off the ground because we know that that's way overreach. I think that, me personally, I think there should be term limits for people in Congress, but it shouldn't come from an executive order. So the question is, where do you draw the line? And that's always the rub. But it's interesting when you go back and actually read the text and you read these foundational documents, and they all weave together. And that was by design.
Right. And again, it's something where, being an originalist, being almost like a strict constructionist, this stuff makes me crazy. Again, I understand the mechanism behind it. I understand the need for it, but there has to be a limit. The unfortunate thing I get, well, not the unfortunate, but actually that the courts did weigh in on this, and that there's actually been cases where the ability to limit the president's powers under Article 2 were actually, the court struck down, where years ago you had during 1996 when it was, they passed a Brady law.
Yep.
And that they said, Congress specifically said, okay, that we are passing a federal law, but we are also going to require state and local law enforcement to enforce this law for us. And there was a challenge on it. And the Supreme Court came back and said, yeah, Congress, that's great. You pass a law regarding this, but the only person that can forcibly execute laws is the executive branch. The president is the only one that has the executive authority to say that this is how the laws will be enforced. So you pass a law, but you cannot impede upon the Article 2 powers that the president has to faithfully execute them. And so that's basically where Congress tried actually giving the executive authority, giving the executive branch more authority. And the court was saying, in my reading of it, it's sort of contradictory, where they're saying you can't do this because only the president can do this, but then the president doesn't have, it's sort of.
And for everyone out there, let me just be very, very clear, because I want to make sure that this is clear. When we talk about the Article 2 power to enforce, to faithfully make sure that the laws of the country are faithfully executed and enforced, it's not the president, it's the executive branch.
Right.
President is the head of the executive branch, but the president doesn't go out and do this. You're like, why didn't Biden do this? Why didn't Trump do this? Why didn't Obama? No. The executive branch encompasses things like the Department of Justice, the Department of the Treasury, all that kind of stuff. Those are the underlying branches of government. And actually, the executive branch, I think, is the largest branch of government by far.
Yes.
And those branches underneath that stem out from Article 2 from the president and going down, they're the ones who actually do the enforcement. It isn't the president himself. So just make sure we're on the same page.
Yeah. I mean, and the last thing that we'll go, like going back to the Youngstown issue, and that I think really that the main thing with the Youngstown issue is that the way that the court sort of split the baby on it is that they broke it down into basically what they said, three different categories.
3 different categories, right?
Yep. And you had the one where that the strongest category was where that the president was acting with express or implied congressional authorization, where the Congress said, "Thou shalt," and the president's like, "Cool, rock on, let's do it." Then is what they call section, category 2, which is the twilight zone area, where Congress is silent, where there's no specific thing, no specific acts granting
Doesn't
it.
say you can, doesn't say you can't.
Right, exactly. Then the last one is the weakest one, where they, that category 3, where they're saying the president is directly contravening what Congress has said,
and that's usually
trying to use his Article 2 authority, even though Congress has already said no, and even though there's really no authorization under the Constitution other than the broad executive, I can do whatever the want powers that the president has. So
right, and if you're in that
just
last,
so people understand that,
and if you're in that last category, the chances of you coming out of a decision from the federal court thinking that your executive order is going to float are not very good.
as Truman found out.
Exactly.
So then, I mean, going on to some of the other issues that we have,
You're saying I have issues?
Dude, so many issues, so many issues. That one of the things that, again, strikes me near and dear to my heart is the Article 2 Commander-in-Chief powers. You want to discuss that one now?
I think we should. When we first started talking about doing the channel to begin with, we were like, this is going to be, we worry about it being dry. But every time we step into each individual aspect of the founding documents, each paragraph, each amendment, each section, we're like, holy crap. They're like all these things going on.
Case comes up.
Going on in the world right now in our country that directly impact or are impacted by this particular thing. Like, which is why you need to know this stuff. Go ahead.
Right. So the Article of Commander-in-Chief powers. The president has the authority as a commander-in-chief.
I have to say it. I'm sorry. You will respect my authority.
Sorry. You will respect my authority. And being a former military officer, being a former JAG officer, especially, this is something that really hits me near and dear to my heart. Where, recently, that there's been a lot of different challenges to the president's authorities under Article 2 Commander-in-Chief regarding National Guard call-ups, and that's been going on for a number of years now, as well as recently something that came out, which I lost my mind on, is where you had congressional members that are actually former military members.
Some of them
coming forward and say again.
Some of them,
yeah.
I think coming of the forward, 6, I think 4 of the 6 or something like that.
Right, and then the other ones were intelligence officers.
Yeah.
Where they came forward and basically actively called for military members to disobey lawful orders. And the one thing that they hang their hat on is they hang their hat on provisions under the UCMJ, Uniform Code of Military Justice, saying that you have the authority to disobey unlawful orders. Well, on the face, that is absolutely true. But it's clear that the UCMJ is clear that there's actually Supreme Court cases that are on that deal with it as well, saying that yes, you can disobey unlawful orders, but that is not something that an individual officer has the ability to do. That is not up to me as an individual to decide. That is something that is decided upon a higher level, like commanding officer level, even higher than that.
Yep.
Like Joint Chiefs of Staff level. And that it's the UCMJ is very, very clear on this, where that is not something where if you simply have a a personal disagreement with it, or a political disagreement with it, or even a religious disagreement with it, that's not up to you. When you raise your hand, and when you raise your hand and you swore that oath, that's where a lot of your individual liberties ended, even including First Amendment rights, where they're saying that you have one of the congressmen saying, "No, it's my First Amendment right to be able to speak this way." Well, since you are a retired officer and yet you are still subject to recall under the UCMJ, no, you're not. For me, as a retired officer, as a retired senior officer, I gave up that right. So, if I went out and said, disobey this order, I'm exposing myself to UCMJ action. And so that is not something that individual member of the military, no matter what your rank is, can say, I'm not going to do this. So that's something that, again, you have, you have a bunch of different articles that deal with that. Article 90 of the UCMJ, Article 91, Article 92, and all those deal with failure to obey regulations, failure to obey orders. That, again, it's a UCMJ Article 2, persons subject to this chapter specifically says, if you're a retired officer, you're still subject to the UCMJ. And it's just something that really, when I first saw these news articles it come out on the news about these Congress people doing this, I called up Rob and I was losing my shit. I was like, what in the ever living Jiminy are these people thinking of? And the problem is, people are
It
like,
was a little
well,
more blue than that.
yeah,
Go
yeah.
ahead.
And just to go off on sort of a short tangent on this as well, is that the danger of that is that the military is based upon the cohesiveness of your unit, and that you have to be operating in lockstep with one another. If you are not, and if people individually challenge orders and say, I'm not going to do this because of this, then the cohesion breaks down. And then, you know, my favorite saying is, I'm not fighting for the people in front of me, I'm fighting for the people behind me. And that, as an officer, I need to be able to know that when I was in the field, I could trust that the person behind me is doing their job, and they need to be able to trust me fully to know that I am doing my job in front of me.
Right.
I can't have a moment of questioning. And so to call on people on that, to like question these authorities, it's one, it's bad, and two, it's not based in law. If anything, is based in direct contravention of the law.
And I'm going to go back to one of our earlier episodes when we were talking about freedom of speech. We had talked about the fact that people feel entitled. It's me, I, and they don't care so much about the collective us. So when there's been a call in the past 6 months, certainly longer than that, but it's been more acute in the past 6 months for various reasons, to everyone dial down the temperature of what you're saying, because words have consequences. And it is not in any way surprising that there will be people who are a little unhinged, who, when they hear over and over and over and over and over and over again, people on one side of a debate or a thought process or a party or whatever, who calls the other side demonic, Nazis, this, everything debasing beyond words, that you do that, it has a corrosive effect. So when Lou called me up and he was losing his mind, when these 6 people, members of Congress, were starting to say, they didn't say that, and since then, they, when put under scrutiny, they can't identify any illegal orders that have been given. But it was that still insinuation. Well, we're living in terrible times with terrible people and in power and whatever. So the insinuation is there that they kept that temperature up, ratcheted up, and then attacked the chain of command. I am not a former military person, but I can appreciate the fact that the chain of command is sacrosanct, because I have dear friends and family, Lou being one, who I've talked with over many, many decades and talked about the chain of command. And as a historian, all right, not a historian where I've written, tomes and books and whatever, but someone who is steeped in the history of our particular country, the way it has been formulated, the way wars have been fought. I've talked about World War II, Korea, World War I, the Civil War, and you involve yourself inherently in those discussions, the military aspect, and you see that there's the chain of command, and the chain of command is sacrosanct. And when you have people who go in and try to undermine those Article 2 powers to bring it back to what we're talking about, you're playing with fire with this country, because this country, this is part of the bedrock of this country. And I would imagine, and I would hope, that if the shoe were on the other foot party-wise, that while Barack Obama was in the Oval Office, or Joe Biden, or Jimmy Carter, or John F. Kennedy, or whatever Democratic president you want to think of, if 6 Republicans did the same thing, I would hope that the Democrats would come with the same kind of fire and fury against them. I'm not here to talk about political parties, about they're wrong, because it's the concept, and we're talking about Article 2. And the president does have, by the constitutional fiat, granting him to be the commander-in-chief. So,
Right. I mean, and then also building upon that, you have some of the challenges about, some of the recent actions where, the military actions that are happening down in the, South Atlantic area, down off South America, and other actions like that, where, again, this is something where so long as it can be tied into the defense of the United States and not considered an offensive war, where an offensive war that's declared by the president and ratified by Congress, okay, no worries about that. But so long as the president can say that this is something to repel, the common things are repel an invasion or protect the borders and preserve the sanctity of the United States, he has that authority under Article 2, Commander-in-Chief as well. So before people start going off about, oh my gosh, this is wrong, and he doesn't have the authority. Yeah, he does. He does. That you could argue that certain things may be seen as offensive war, but so long as it's based somewhat on a legal basis and there's some legal foundation for it.
right. And as Lou said, I mean, the issue here for people to raise questions, I'm glad to have people raise questions. I don't want a bunch of automatons in this country just to be robotically follow whomever might be in charge. As we've talked about, this country is built upon debate and questions and discussion. So it's healthy to say, well, wait a minute. Lou's talking about these actions in the Caribbean and, in the waters close to South America, which are happening now, the late 2025. Some people can ask, like, well, what basis do you have to do that? What evidence do you have to show that this is part of defending national security? Those are all valid questions and should be asked.
Right.
They ought to be asked. They need to be vetted. But at the end of the day, if they can be successfully tied into those parameters, then yes, Article 2 powers can be exerted.
So what else do we have? What are the other Article 2 powers that we can discuss?
And for you out there, down in the comments, we'd love to hear from you. We want to hear from you about what you think about Article 2 powers. What are the things that you think that are kind of sketchy, or the things that ought to be discussed, or executive orders? Any more questions about that? Someone's particularly excited about the appointment of ambassadors. We'll talk about that too. That's in the Article 2. We want this to be interactive. We've said it over and over again. We will continue to say it over and over again. We want this to be interactive. So please.
I really want to talk about Section 3.
Well, we're going to get there next episode. So hold your horses, damn it. But until then, remember, make the algorithm, I'll say,
work for us.
Our bitch, and make it work for us.
Who does number 2 work for?
Us. So we want you to hit that like button, because that will help the algorithm in our favor. We want you to subscribe. We want you to hit the comments. We want you to talk about stuff here. We want you to spread the word. Right now, we have a certain number of people who are subscribed. By the time we get to Article 3 next time, we want to see that number doubled. We want to see
500. We want 500 within a month. I'm making an ask. Fine.
There you go. Do that. I bet you can't. I bet you can't do it. Yes, you can. Yeah. Do it.
But anyway, again, thank you. I mean, we're going to continue on this rant because there's just so much more to discuss regarding some of the Article 2 issues and some of the powers. And then then you'll be able to tune in for the rest of it. And thank you very much. We can't do this without you. And until next time, cheers, brother.
Cheers. I only have a little bit left. It's a good thing.
All right. Well, then it's time to take a break and refill.
There you go. Cheers to you all.
Till next time. Hoorah.
Love the country. Learn it. Love it. Live it.
Live it. Later, Rob.
See you, Luke.
Shut up and sit down.
Thanks for listening to The Republic, If You Can Keep It podcast. Join Rob and Lou in our next episode as we continue our riveting discussions on the most important topics affecting our great republic. Drop a line for topics you want to discuss, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. Until next time.